Welcome to Keepers of the Culture. I'm Angela Pace, and this limited podcast series was created during a moment of national reflection, the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. As our nation marks this milestone, we pause to ask a deeper question: whose stories have shaped this country, and how are they being remembered? This series is being recorded in Ohio, a state shaped by many cultures, communities, and places whose contributions are essential to understanding both our past and our future. Keepers of the Culture exist as a mechanism for amplifying, honoring, and preserving those stories told by the people who lived them, protected them, and continue to carry them forward. Each episode centers on a place, a community, or a cultural legacy that has helped define Ohio and, in turn, the nation itself. Together, we reflect on where we've been, examine where we are, and imagine where we are going. This is not just history, this is living memory. This is stewardship. Thank you for joining us as Keepers of the Culture.
3 things you can expect to learn on today's podcast: the true history of Poindexter Village, how segregation actually forged community strength, and the future of Poindexter's legacy. And before this episode is over, you'll hear something that would completely change how you think about what a housing project really is, and why one woman says she remembers her neighborhood very differently than the one the rest of the world describes. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Angela Pace. Welcome to this episode of Keepers of the Culture. Okay, even if you didn't grow up there, if somebody says the village, everybody knows they're talking about Poindexter Village, and that's what we're going to talk about today, Poindexter Village, and the impact that this neighborhood had, not just on Central Ohio, but also how neighborhoods like it throughout Central Ohio were able to help shape the Black community. I have two incredible guests who are really going to help to bring this conversation along. Rita Smith is the historian of Poindexter Village. You are one of the founders of the James Preston Poindexter
Yes.
Foundation.
Yes.
And then the lovely and talented Shelby Toon over here.
You.
Shelby is heading up the Poindexter Museum project here at the Ohio History Connection, and we are so proud to have some youth here, right, Rita?
Absolutely.
Who can bring in that younger
Absolutely.
aspect. Rita, you and I both know Poindexter intimately. I was born and raised there. Spent the first 6 or 7 years of my life there. My mom was raised there, and
Okay.
you raised your family there.
Yes.
So when somebody says Poindexter Village to you, what do you think of?
I recall I was a young, newly married person, and then I had my children there in the village. The village was a continuation of the greater community of which I had grown up in. And in fact, I have a lot of personal uh, relationships to the story. It goes back to my family and Reverend Poindexter, and just the greater sense of community of that period in time. Um, my sisters used to brag that they were there on that Saturday morning when President Roosevelt came to Poindexter and dedicated it.
So let's talk about that, because it was Franklin D. Roosevelt who was
Yes.
responsible for the
Yes.
establishment
Yes.
of Poindexter Village and other
Yes.
communities like that. It was built for the Black community.
Right.
What was the reasoning for that?
Well, it was just so happens, about 90 years ago, that we were at the end of the Depression, and it came to be the beginning of the Second World War. It was an economic time. It was at the end of the Depression, people didn't have jobs. So it was an opportunity to create affordable housing and yet create jobs. And it was a time when our Black communities were communities. It was an extended community. And I always like to describe Poindexter Village as being nestled in the midst of that Black community.
Well, let's talk about the nestling part and what the Black community is. And so, Shelby, you've done a lot of research on Poindexter
Oh, yeah.
as well. For those who don't know where it is slash was, kind of give us the boundaries of what Poindexter Village, where it was nestled in.
Okay, well, Poindexter Village was between the historic Mount Vernon Avenue and Long Street. And actually, I was just talking to Miss Rita. She was giving me some context that, the Blackberry Patch was only a portion of Poindexter Village. There were 33 original buildings, but by later there were 35. So, the buildings were between Mount Vernon and Long Street, right there in between the Black community where things are thriving on Mount Vernon Avenue, businesses are thriving on Long Street. And so, people say Poindexter Village was kind of the heart of it all there, but it really was that complete community that made up what was, I would consider the village we
village,
always
right,
refer to. So,
right.
yeah.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of people who don't know the history of Poindexter Village think of it as a housing project, which sometimes has negative connotations. But as a little girl growing up there, I saw everybody going to work.
Yes.
I didn't see people just
That's right.
laying, sitting on the porch
Right.
waiting for a check. I saw people getting up, going to the bus stop because a lot of us didn't have
That's
cars
right.
back in
That's
those
right.
days, and going to work. And I remember my grandmother telling me my job and my sister's job was to go to school and get educated. So where did this misconception come from? Is it just because it was a Black neighborhood?
Well, it wasn't just a Black neighborhood to us at that time.
Right.
I was born on South 22nd Street, and we could walk from over there to that community, to the Black business community, because that was where the 5 theaters were, the restaurants, the church. So that was a broader economic area. And it became successful because you could work in the community. That kept the dollars in the community. And then not only did you gave people an opportunity to go spend their money, it also gave money to be able to live there. But I remember I first described that I lived there as a newlywed, but I remember going there as a teenager.
It was the place
And
to
it was
be. Yeah.
it was the place to be. I remember going to the community, to the little community area where we have little dances.
You getting ready to break into a dance?
Oh yeah,
right
I
now?
am.
Look at you.
I can
Okay.
remember you get close. That was when you
Okay,
dance
calm
close.
down.
Okay. But so I have 2 sets of memories of that village.
It's amazing, though, when you think about it, and you talk about Long Street and Mount Vernon Avenue. And as a little girl, I remember my grandmother would take us to Mount Vernon, and we could walk up and down Mount Vernon and shop,
absolutely.
and then up and down Long Street. In fact,
Absolutely.
what do they call Long Street? The $1 Million Mile.
It was that whole area was called
Yeah,
a
the
$1 Million Mile because we had all of the businesses. You had the first Black hospital there at Long and 17th.
Mhm. You talk about the theaters.
The
And of
theaters,
course, the Lincoln
yes,
is still there and
yes,
has been reborn,
it's
and
the
we're
only
so proud
one.
of that. But then there were also a lot of clubs, and
Mhm.
it was
Rest-
Mount Vernon Avenue had so many clubs where so many musicians got started. You're way too young to know anything about that, but I'm sure you've heard about it maybe from your grandfather or your dad. It was one of those places where during the daytime
Mhm.
you could walk up and down the street and do your shopping and
Absolutely.
sightseeing or whatever. But then at night it turned into this. It was like Vegas. Well, no, that's a terrible thing
right.
because there was no legal gambling going on. But
right.
it was. I'm sure you experienced the nightlife there. So what was that like? What was it
I
like
was a
being
little
on-
too young.
a little too young. Okay.
But I remember the Lincoln across from the Lincoln Theater was the Empress Theater,
Yeah.
where Daddy Grace
Mm-hmm.
would be there. And many young people don't know about Daddy Grace and that
The church.
the church
Yeah.
back then. But next to that was the Regal Theater club, and it was upstairs. But people don't appreciate that because Columbus sitting in the center of Ohio, when the entertainers were going to Chicago or Detroit, they came through here. Columbus had a wonderful collection of musicians, and the entertainment was there. And then there at the corner of Long and Hamilton, remember, segregation kept us as a complete little everything we needed
It was right there.
was in
It was
our
right there.
community.
Yeah.
So those hotels that were listed in the Green Book
Yeah.
were they're on St. Clair or they're at Hamilton and Long. So you had the facilities to accommodate the musicians and entertainers that came through this area.
And a lot of
So
them came through
Long
here.
Street
Yeah.
and Mount Vernon
It was jumping.
were jumping.
It was jumping.
And-
So you talked about some of the musicians, and then Shelby, you can chime in here too, because I know you've done your history. Let's talk about some of the famous folks, or folks who are famous now or famous then, who came either out of Poindexter Village or from that extended neighborhood. So I know the first person you're going to say.
I was
Or
gonna
you.
see- I was gonna see
Okay,
what she
look at her
said.
face. Why are you thinking?
I'm having a senior moment right
All
now.
right. Amina.
Yeah, Amina was
Amina Brenda
yes.
Lynn Robinson.
She's an international artist, and she was born there in the village in the 40s.
She told me later on when I got a
mhm.
chance to meet her, and I introduced myself to her, and she said, "I know who you are." She said, "You're Carol's daughter." So she knew my mom.
Mhm.
That's how small Columbus is,
Mhm.
Black Columbus anyway. But again, just an incredible artist with an international reputation. And Amina, a lot of her work, her early work anyway, focused on
Yeah.
the village and the Bronzeville area.
I can add to that. You know, one thing that is just really important to this community about getting this museum right is that when we lift up the neighborhood, we need to lift it up as an arts and culture neighborhood. It thrived in arts and culture. And I think, you know, not just in music and entertainment, but we were like the mecca of stop through here for even, you know, all the way down to our, you know, civil rights. You know, you came through our community, you stopped through this community to make sure that you were connecting with the African American community, which essentially was connecting you to the national community, right? But then when I think about even Amina Robinson and her impact, right? She grew up in Poindexter Village, born and raised. There's a story we love to tell about how she would do her drawings under her childhood bedroom and things like that. But if she was not nurtured from this community, she would have never even had, you know, the wherewithal to be an artist and to know that she can tell this story. And she really realized early how significant this community was. Her memory mapping, her ability to tell stories and get the history of how her family migrated to Ohio. I mean, that's just really priceless how she was able to be from this community, share its story. And, you know, we're all very thankful for not just her, but all the artists and all the folks who have really spent the time to keep this community lifted up as it changes, you know.
And you talk about a lot of you were talking about musicians earlier, and there were musicians, even if they weren't from the village or from that near east side, who performed there. Nancy Wilson was one. And I know that Gene Walker, who was from Columbus, he performed at the Lincoln. He has told me stories about his performances at the Lincoln, how when he was a little boy, he would sneak into the Lincoln
That's right.
to see.
I did something that I wasn't supposed to.
I'm sure you did not.
They had what they called the Midnight Ramble. And I ran around with the little older girls.
Oh.
And they would slip me into the Lincoln.
Rita.
That was Mom's Mabley.
Oh, wow.
Fox. No, what's the
Red
other?
Fox?
Red Fox. But did you know that Sammy Davis
Yep.
Jr.
Yep.
got his started
Yep.
at the Lincoln Theater?
He was
That's
like
right.
3 years old.
Yeah.
And he just kind
So
of jumped up on stage.
yes, so the history goes so deep.
But Rita, talk about being a family in Poindexter Village. One of the things that you always hear about the village is that sense of family. I know that we lived on Clifton Avenue, 1330 something Clifton Avenue, and every grown up there was an auntie or an uncle,
That's right. That's right.
and they were all part of an extended family. And I know personally that they were allowed to discipline children who were not theirs if they saw those children acting up. And it was the kind of thing now people may shake their head and go, oh, no, that's not right. But what it did was it created a sense, at least for me as a little girl, a sense of safety, a sense of being loved and cared for, even by people who didn't live in that house with me. And I can remember a lot of those older folks who basically kept me from being a bad girl who would sneak into the Lincoln Theater.
But, you know, I think we need to talk about our culture. That is something that has been with us throughout all of our generations, from the experiences of our families coming out of the slave experience, or even when we had to take care of each other. And there isn't a bright side to segregation, but there was a positive. Segregation allowed us to be close, and we had to be extended families. And when you love your extended family, you discipline your extended family. So you may be over on that other street and do something. You were disciplined there, but you got disciplined again when you got home, you know?
Yes.
But that was that loving sense of community that in all of our Black settlements, whether it be in the village, wherever it was, that is something that is unique to us. I always like to say what they denied us or said, you know, we were creators. We created everything everybody else said we couldn't have. And when you talk about discipline, I think about our education opportunities. And I think about in the midst of the village and across from where I happened to have lived when I was a young married person was Champion Junior High School.
Junior High School, yeah.
Do
My
you
mom
know
went to Champion.
that my family had moved from South 22nd Street to the west side. But on Sunday mornings, I had caught the bus or the streetcar and came to the east side to go to Shiloh. And then my mom had originally gone to Second Baptist Church. So I had all those connections with the churches.
And the elementary
Right.
schools and Champion, because it was Pilgrim.
Pilgrim.
And I know Champion was the middle school, as they call it now.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the biggie was
Yeah.
East High School being right there.
But I was thinking of when Champion was put together, it was the opportunity to have all your Black teachers. And I loved it. One of our professors did a dissertation on Champion, and she described that when Mr. Mitchell was one of the first principals there was a statement that students had to read when they came to school every morning, and it was about excellence. And that set up that discipline. Excellence, if you misbehave, your behavior was not proper. And that's where we learned respect for one another, love for one another, and you may have had a disagreements, but because you loved and cared for each other, you didn't have the violence that we see in today's society. But it was that education, the value of education, the value for each other. And that's what made the village, as well as the overall community in which it was nestled, that those were the standards and values. And I have to speak to the name of Poindexter Village. We have to speak of Reverend James Poindexter. And he was the epitome of character. He was the epitome of honesty. And if we named that village after him and that community, then we were honoring him.
And
that's why it was so, you lived up to it.
He was also the first Black Columbus City Council member.
Yes.
And the first Black school board member, too.
And because as it was a ward system, going to politics, it was a ward system which supported that.
And he was representing his neighborhood.
And he lived at 41 North 4th Street, but his barber shop was on High Street at what we used to call the Neal House. And because he was a barber, and that was a profession for our Black communities, my ancestors were barbers. That was one of the occupations that was a very common occupation for Afro-American males. But because he was across from the State House, he had the ear of the politicians.
He had the hookup.
And they were governors. Then they became presidents. So he had influence not only here and in the state, but he had influence nationally.
Well, he also was, again, the namesake for, or the motivation and the inspiration for Poindexter Village and everything that Poindexter Village became. And I just know, and I tell people this all the time, I've told you this, Shelby, that I was a young girl. My sisters and I were very young when my mom moved us in to her old house, my grandmother's house there on Clifton. And it was the safest and the happiest I've ever been, which is really sad because I'm 112 now. And to think that was the high point of happiness and for me. But that's the way the children, that's the way we were made to feel. And I'm just so glad. I still have, now we're going to talk about something sad, though, the demolition of Poindexter Village and kind of the demise of that neighborhood first. But I remember when I found out that they were going to demolish most of the buildings, that I went to my friend Charles Hillman over at CMHA, and I said, do me a favor, save me 3 bricks. So he saved me 3 bricks, one for myself and one for each of my 2 sisters. And so we each still have a brick. I have mine right in my living room, in the fireplace, because I wanted that piece of the happiest time of my life. And unfortunately, though, this neighborhood went the way of way too many Black neighborhoods with the general demise. And a lot of that started, Shelby, with the creation of highways.
Yeah. So first, everything that you all have said, I've continued to hear as we do like oral history collections and hear other people's story. I mean, it's consistent across everyone's story, just how connected Poindexter Village was, and that proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. This was the definition of that. I think, too, something that just inevitably has happened to our African American communities is disinvestment. And so as beautiful and as wonderful as those buildings were in 1940, by 2000, right, we had at that point seen the 80s and everything that, this change has happened to the community. So when it came down to what to do with those buildings and them deciding to demolish it, I think it put an awakening in many folks like both of yourselves, where it's like, well, wait a minute, these are more than bricks. There's a story here and a true community here. And one thing I commend our community for all the time is for speaking up. We don't always have the answers, but we sure will say something. And so just being able to plant those seeds to be able to see what could be. And when they decided that the best decision was to reimagine Poindexter Village, I know a lot of folks were looking for those bricks. Like, how do I hold on to a piece of it? And if it wasn't for the work of people like Miss Rita and even yourself for just advocating and using your voice and how important this story is, we wouldn't be here today with trying to save this story, right?
And that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so Shelby, you were describing how important the museum is to where Poindexter Village is now, or where the story of Poindexter Village is now. And it's a shame, though, that the the neighborhood was torn down, but at the time, because of the construction of highways through the neighborhood, through the Near East Side, it cut the neighborhood off almost from the rest of the world. And so that created a lot more poverty and unfortunately a lot more crime. But now we're at the point where even though the buildings are gone, Poindexter Village is still going to live on.
Yeah, it's there. It's there. It looks
And-
different, but it's there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I can remember in 2008, it doesn't, what the Lord has planned. We're always wanting to do things in a hurry. This has been almost 15 years ago. We were working, what you were saying, how it had changed. When we lived there, you did not misbehave. You did not miss a payment. You didn't have loud parties. You didn't have those little skirmishes. Society, as you were saying, changed. And those standards were reduced. And in 2008, there was a group, a justice group, that were meeting at Beatty Center, which was essential to the success of the village because children had a place to be at Beatty. We didn't talk about that. But in 2008, this group, we were meeting to work with the residents of Poindexter in that transition period. And we heard at one of our meetings, the city was going to demolish the village. That justice group immediately said, wait a minute. And that is when we talked about, no, we cannot lose Poindexter Village. And because it was under HUD, it had to go through what they call the 106 process, that you cannot demolish federal properties without going through that. And we had meetings almost for 2 years, every Tuesday, to go through that 106 process. They were going to save originally 10 buildings. And we worked with the housing
CMHA.
CMHA, and they were going to save 10. And they had an expert group that studied the buildings. And they said, these buildings were built to last 100 years. Don't be telling, The committee itself, that is our mentor from OHC, Kathy Nelson. Do you remember Kathy Nelson?
I do.
Kathy Nelson was a part of that expert group. And we were having a meeting at the community house. And CMHA came in and said, "Oh, we're not going to save the 10. We're going to tear the 8 down." So then we were left with 2. And then from that process, again, remember it's been a 15-year process. Then they went from 10 to 2, and there was another community meeting. And they said, "Oh, we're going to tear down 1 of the 2 and maybe do something with some exhibit or something on 1." Kathy Nelson got up in the meeting. Oh no. Kathy was our hero.
So we've saved 2 of the buildings
But-
that are going to be the museum, right?
And no, now that would be. But they weren't going to save the 2. And I'm sorry, my minister was sitting next to me. We used to do demonstrations, and my minister was with us, Pastor Watkins. She's sitting next to me. Can I tell you what I did?
Oh, goodness.
I jumped up. "Are you saying you're telling us to hell with our history?" And that was written into the dispatch. And there is my minister, and I'm up here talking about hell.
Okay, and we're going to talk more
Okay.
about the museums in
But-
just a
but
minute.
anyways,
let me just
I'm
first
sorry.
process the fact that you cursed
Okay.
in front of your minister.
Uh,
So we talked,
But that's part of the story of
Okay, and we'll-
saving. That's how we ended up with 2 buildings.
and we'll get
Okay.
back to that in a minute. I wanted to talk a little bit about. I talked about a little bit about how the community changed when the community changed.
Yeah.
And up to that point, though, what kind of an impact was that community having on its people? How were people affected by living in that community and then by the change in the community?
Right. I think this particular community, I mean, one thing that it had to get used to early by being segregated, a segregated community, is change was inevitable. We didn't have control over where they put the freeways. We didn't have control over how many public housing ventures they put in our community. We didn't have control over really a lot of, I would say the more civic and the things that happen and the decisions that are made that we didn't get to speak to. So I think a piece of being a part of the African American community is the unknowns, right? And being resilient enough to continue to hold on to what you can and make the best out of every change. I would say the community has spent a lot of time adapting to things, right? Like when you think about the history of Mount Vernon and Longstreet and the different phases it went through, right? How freeways came through and changed how the businesses succeeded or not, right?
That's right.
When the freeways also came through, it didn't take much time, but we started leaving our community, and so, it really is one of those things where I think that we know, how good it used to be. I particularly, my generation, if I can speak to that.
Yes, you may.
We got the aftermath of the love, right? Like, I remember when, I would go to church. So I grew up in Second Baptist Church, where, Reverend Poindexter, that was his church. So I was very much familiar with who Poindexter was and how significant the neighborhood was. As I grew, I learned more and more, but it was always some historical fact or something that just made it that much more of a richer story to me. But I've always come from a rich community, right? And I would say even in the church, that whole village to raise a child thing showed up in our churches.
Absolutely.
I can't tell you how many people know me from church for reasons, whether that be, my participation in ministry or something else, So I think our community has been very much, they say 10 toes down about preserving this history because it is the fabric of who we are even still today. Even when we think about the changes that the city has seen, a lot of that has been on the backs of African Americans from this community, right? When you think about even just, what makes Columbus cool, I would say the Near East Side is definitely one of those things that has made Columbus what it is today.
Because we had swagger.
Oh
back then,
man,
as Mayor Coleman used to say,
right,
swagger.
right. We had culture. We have we have family. We have each other, and so I just think that as this community continues to change, we need to remain still unchanged about the fact of who we are, what this community has always been. Being, I try to be actively involved in any preservation venture in that community because we are genuinely fighting for what is left. Everything is changing. There are plans for the community that happen to us, not with us. And so sometimes, we're grateful for the resilience of those folks who spoke up and said, no, we need space. We need space for our stories. We need a place to tell this story. And although Poindexter Village isn't the original 35 buildings, it's still there in its spirit through what has been reimagined. And so now you have all these new residents and people who live in the community. They need to know what they're a part of. They're on sacred soil. And what is that, what is that story that they need to know so that they even can have connection even into who they are, right?
So you talked about growing up in the church,
Yeah.
Second Baptist Church, and I think all of us have church in our background. I remember when we were in Poindexter Village, we went to Union Grove, which was right there. You could throw a rock at Union Grove from our front porch. And a lot of times that was the cohesion, that in the school system, that was the cohesion that kind of kept us all together. What's holding Black folks in these communities together now?
I'm my family historian.
You're everybody's historian, Rita.
And I'm related, I think, to everybody.
You are, except me.
But no, we don't
That's
know.
That's right. What am I saying?
But in our experience culturally, wherever you found a settlement of Blacks, wherever we ended up, you had two things always: the church and the school. Because as a people, we knew education was essential, and we knew we were here with the grace of the Lord. And so that is what kept us in all of the negative things that have happened to us culturally and socially. Those two things were the essence. When DSAG came into being, and economically things changed, we started moving out. And our Black communities, when we say a Black community, it isn't a Black community anymore. And when we were in that segregated community, our family, the extended family, protected us. But now our children are growing up in the suburbs. They don't have that connectiveness. They don't hear their stories. When we were in Poindexter, I can remember back from when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult, when I had problems. Union Grove saved me and my babies. Reverend Hale walked them streets.
Oh, wow.
Our children don't have that today. We're losing our story. And as that family historian, you got the roots, you got the trunk, and you got the branches.
All right. I like that. It's interesting. You talk about people from the village and that whole family feel. To this day, if I run into any of the Burgesses, we live next door to the Burgesses,
Right.
and I'll run into. In fact, one of them, my sister is his insurance agent. That's just how that's how Columbus. That's how we do it in Columbus, right? But it's funny. I will always remember living next door to the Burgesses, and Mrs. Burgess would be outside with the grill, doing hot dogs on the grill, and I'd be out on the back stoop. And I'd say, boy, Miss Burgess, those hot dogs sure smell good.
Oh,
And
that's
she
right.
said, Lenny, well, they call me Lenny back then. It's a
Yeah.
whole different story. But Lenny, you want a hot dog? Yes, ma'am, I do. And it was just that whole thing. And then my grandmother would get upset because she thought I was begging for food, like we didn't have
Yep.
enough to
Yeah.
eat. But to be able to tell those stories and the stories of the carnivals that they
That's
used to
right.
have,
That's right.
and Beatty Park,
That's
and
right.
just trick or treating just right
Right.
there in the neighborhood in
Right.
Union Grove, where so many community activities went on. It always tickles me if I go someplace and I run into somebody and I'll say, didn't you used to live on Clifton? Or
Mhm.
didn't you used to go to
Yeah.
whatever, the
Mhm.
Union Grove? And to be able to share those kinds of
Mhm.
stories, it brings all of that back. And to your point, Rita, it's sad that in too many cases, that whole feeling of community has dissipated. And I
Mhm.
don't want to say disappeared. I refuse to be
Mhm.
that
Right.
negative.
Right.
But it's changed, it's
That's right.
dissipated. But there is hope. And we're going to talk about
Mhm.
the future
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
there is hope, people.
There is.
Yeah, we're going to keep hope alive.
That's
And we're
right.
going to talk about that in just a minute.
Okay.
All right, so ladies, we have talked about the past, Poindexter Village, and the broader Black community
Mhm.
here in Central Ohio, and we've talked about the present a little bit. And as we start looking at the future, though, we have to look at what's happening now and how we're going to fix it or challenge it. So, what do you think, Shelby, as a young person,
Okay.
what do you think are the challenges, the most urgent challenges that we as a Black community have to deal with right now?
Hmm. There's a couple things that come to mind. One is that time is of the essence. And a lot of these stories, because of African American um, documentation, just has not been done as thoroughly as other cultures. Ours is in our oral histories, ours is in the stories that Miss Rita and folks like yourself share. And so I would say one of the most urgent things is capturing these roots, capturing these stories, getting the information. Um, that's one of the biggest pieces on for me, where it's just time is of the essence. You know, we've got to get this done and capture these stories before we can't capture them anymore. That's one, and it goes the same thing for our buildings. You know, our buildings are being flipped left and right, and there's a lot of story in each of these buildings, and being able to have a moment to capture what it was before it goes into being what it is going to be in the future is very, very, time is of the essence.
So you talk about
Yeah.
capturing, but where do you see people actively right now trying to keep the culture
Oh,
alive? Before we talk about the
yeah.
museum, where outside of that
Yeah.
are we actively trying to keep stories of our culture alive and our culture in
Yeah.
general?
I would say, as much as the community is changing, don't sleep on our community. Our community is getting the work done. I mean, we have, if you think about it, with this museum, we'll have several Black owned institutions still thriving in this neighborhood. And this neighborhood has always had Black institutions and cultural centers. It's been the mecca of that for decades. And so I would say the work is never done. It doesn't look the same, but it's still being done. You've got King Arts Complex and now the Lincoln Theater and Maroon Arts
Maroon
Group and
Arts, right?
Urban League. And, I could keep coming down the street on all the folks and stories and people who are trying to do the work. And not to mention our churches have never stopped doing the work. Our the Near East Side and Poindexter Village and everything that makes up that area. Churches are on every corner. They're almost like 3 or 4 houses down, buildings down from each other.
Yeah.
We just have tons of churches. And it speaks a lot to who we are. Like Miss Rita said, that faith pillar as a part of the African American experience has never changed. It never changed.
And then let's talk about some of the small businesses that
Mm-hmm.
are still, maybe they're new to the area, maybe they're not, maybe they're kind of reinventing themselves in the area. And I think about like Al Edmondson and a Cut Above
Mm-hmm.
Barbershop right there on
Hasn't moved.
20th and
Yeah,
Mount
he's
Vernon.
still there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And he's
yeah.
still trying to uplift
That's
Mount
right.
Vernon Avenue. And then I look at Creole Kitchen,
Mm,
Chef Butcher, who moved his restaurant from Mount Vernon over to Long
that's
Street, more
right.
room right down the street from the Lincoln Theater, and just all those businesses that are either have been there for more than a minute,
Yeah.
or some of the new businesses at Adelphi Bank
Yeah.
right there on Long
That's right.
Street. So you're right, it's not, don't give up on the
Yeah.
black
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
Don't give up. We still there. We still fighting the good fight, fighting the good fight. But when it comes to making sure that our story is still being told and that it is preserved, that's where a lot of your hard work comes in, Rita, with making sure that the museum, those buildings, those original orange brick buildings are still standing.
And also, it's our story. And our children need our story.
Why?
Can I share? I know I'm not supposed to digress,
But you are going to
but I am
anyway.
going to, as an old person, as
And
your
I have to
elder.
give my elder, and I got
That's
to give you
right.
that.
But I shared just in the community at Bethany Presbyterian Church, where Miss Walker,
Oh, yeah.
very important to our community. Um, there was a community meeting, and it was very encouraging because it was a black community meeting. The community was coming together, and there were two young men that had made a mistake and shared that, and were trying to change. And I happen to have the copy of my great great grandfather's emancipation with me. It was He received his emancipation on March 15th in 1813. That Sunday that we were at that church for that meeting was March 15th. I shared that with that young man, that he could read that emancipation of that young black man from 1813. And when that young man looked and read that, and he turned around, Angela, I haven't seen a face light up. And that whole, just that spirit welled up in that young man. And he looked at that and said, if he can do it, I can do it. That's why we're having a museum.
Right.
So our children could say, in coming out of the 1930s, out of the Depression, no jobs, no place to live. They can do it. We can do it. If they can love each other, we can love each other. That's what it's about.
So what other ways?
I'm
And that's
sorry.
no, no, no.
No,
That was
that's
a beautiful story, and that basically was a beautiful answer. But and we're going to talk more
Yeah.
about the museum. But are there other ways that we, even individually or as groups, book clubs or golf clubs or whatever, other things that we can do to help sustain our cultural stories? I recently did something with the Merrymakers.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Oh,
celebrating their
wonderful.
100th, you
Wonderful.
believe it?
Wonderful.
100th
Wonderful.
anniversary this
Wonderful.
year. And just some of the stories that came out of that organization and their efforts to sustain
Yeah.
not just themselves as an organization, but also their history and all the philanthropy that they're putting forward. So, what
Yeah.
other ways, Shelby, are there for us to sustain, preserve our
Yeah.
culture?
That's a perfect example. A part of the work is continuing the work of these organizations. You know, something that has clearly decreased over time is the way we organize and the way we come together through these groups like the Merrymakers and things like that. I think that, you know, at one point, if you do the history, especially of our community, there were hundreds of organized social groups and movements that were helping to push, you know, the narrative and preserve and do the work. And now, you know, my generation, you know, we just, everyone's just kind of different. We're in our phones, we're doing different things, and we've lost, you know, that that the qualities of having these groups. And so now, you know, Merrymakers are celebrating 100 years, but they're like the loans, they're like a survivor of this time when organizations 100 years ago, social organizations were going up everywhere, especially African Americans. We were, you know, whether it was voting and, you know, women's leagues and even down to sports and I mean, we just had so many options to find community and to come together for a shared cause. So I would say a step, you know, in the right direction would be for young people and for those who have the time to join these social organizations to keep them alive. You know, the folks who are in Merrymakers, they weren't there 100 years ago.
No. Well,
Right.
some of them were. I'm convinced
Right.
a couple of them were.
But that's kind of the piece where it's like we have to continue to be a part of the traditions and the legacy that was passed down to us. You know, more than just hearing or reading about it. How do we actively get involved in it? So yeah, that's how I would say could help.
And the Beatty Centers with Mr. Huckabee used to have champion tennis clubs.
That's right.
To reinvent those experiences for our young people, the Masonic movement, the parades that we used to have, you know, the Elks and the Masons. All of those were we had great leaders, and we have to bring their names to the forefront again to show what they did, like Ninrod Allen.
Oh, Urban League.
And
right?
the Urban League, the NAACP, Russell Jones. That's how we ended up with the Black Walnut Country Club, was through Ninrod Allen and those leaders. Whatever we did have from the even though we don't have a segregated community anymore, we have to find ways of bringing our young Black people together. And you know, if you look at our churches, we used to live in the community in which we went to church. East High School was the Mecca. Those parades from East High to that East High football field was essential to the community. We've got to bring that kind of feeling back. We may not bring them back living in our community anymore. We're out there in the suburbs and all around, but we've got to concentrate on our young people. And we as elders need to find ways of mentoring our young people, but essentially telling our story from our perspective.
And that's one of the things that will happen with the museum.
Yes.
So, okay, practical stuff now. Where are we on the construction, configuration, decoration, preservation? Where are we when it comes to the museum?
Yeah, after what she said, like 15 years of this work,
wow.
The community can proudly say that we will be groundbreaking in spring, which is less than 3 weeks away. And the groundbreaking is a huge milestone because we have working with the community and with the James Preston Poindexter Foundation, Ohio History's found a way by way of Moody Nolan to connect the two buildings without, damaging any of the original.
You can preserve the physicality.
Yes.
Cool.
So one of the things we're really excited about is that the connecting building that connects the two buildings leaves the exterior of the building and the inside of the atrium that we're building for the museum, and we're
it's still the orange brick.
You're still gonna see it. You're still gonna be able to.
What about the green roof?
Yep.
And Patsy is definitely saving how those windows
I know.
look.
I know. We're just really excited about finally getting to this place. It's been a long time coming. A lot of folks all over the city have contributed to this process. We would not be here without the folks and the people who have continued to keep this hope alive. But so spring will begin construction, and we're anticipating a early 2028 opening. And we're just really excited about it, and we're next chapter would be we're in our collecting phase, community collecting phase, which is what I've been
Oh,
most
that should be
exciting
fun.
about. Yeah,
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 that should be a lot. And tell everybody where, for folks who
yeah.
don't know where these buildings are. Where's the museum
So
going to
our
be?
museum address will be 290 North Champion Avenue.
Oh, okay.
We're very excited about that. And if you know anything about Champion Avenue, it's an honor to have an address on Champion. So we're really excited. But it's important to know that what was really exciting about this is working with the Union Grove Baptist Church. So we're right next. The two buildings have been left right next to Union Grove Baptist Church, and we're connecting through a courtyard with the church. There's only a handful of museums in the country that are connected to a church actively open and involved in what the museum's
And it makes
doing.
sense that it would be Union Grove,
Yes,
which has been there
I
like from the
know.
very, very beginning. So how does this make you feel?
As a historian, as savor of the stories, it warms my heart. It and it all of the whatever I've gone through, I could say thank you to the ancestors and thank you to the Lord. Because if it hadn't been through the Lord, we wouldn't be here. He gave us a purpose. And I hope and I pray that our ancestors will say, job well done.
That's right.
As we get ready to close now, what gives you hope, Rita, when you think about the future of Black culture here in Columbus? You played a large part in making sure that some of it's going to be preserved.
I'm looking at some young people today, and I see smiles on their faces, and they're the fruit of the tree. And it's wonderful to see the tree blooming and producing its fruit. That's all and that's what the Lord, Joshua, when them 12 stones, when they crossed the Jordan, the Lord said, bring those stones. So the future generations would ask, what happened here? And we will have saved the stories.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's all about.
I love that, Rita.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, Shelby, like next phase, you talked about collecting
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
items. Just
Yeah.
briefly tell us about that.
So we want this story told by the folks who know the story, right? And so we're going to enter a phase now for digital collecting with photography, and then also collecting items for the replicated apartment experience. So we've saved 3 apartments. We will tell the 1940 story, 1970s and 2000s, and there'll be some in between there as well to preserve those eras and changes. But our goal is for people to get a firsthand look at just what was so great in 1940, because even the rooms, everything, the size was different. So I think it'd just be really great to start filling those apartments with stories from actual folks, from people like Miss Rita and the crew over at James Preston Poindexter Foundation, who have, really fought hard to make sure that, not only their stories preserved, but a lot of them are like second generation. Mm-hmm. So, that their parents' stories are preserved, right? Because the beautiful thing about Poindexter Village was these weren't small families in these houses. No. So many people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of youth that are now papas and, grandmas have come out of Poindexter Village. I mean, you'd be surprised how many stories I hear in 1 week of my life, and it just doesn't stop. And it's always a fresh new last name, always a fresh story, and families are so connected. They know each other, generationally intertwined. So my hope is that this museum does a good job at showing that connection amongst people, and how much everyone was connected, still connected, that the folks that are around now are standing on the shoulders of giants. They are their ancestors' wildest dreams. You know, I'm so excited to, just one day be an elder. Because I actually got to touch Angela Pace. I actually got to, hug Miss Rita. And, it's just really amazing what this can do for our future, their kids, our kids, all the way down the line. So I'm just really excited about us finally putting our best foot forward to making this happen, what it means for the entire story. I mean, we have a lot of work to do in African American preservation, especially in the state of Ohio. And I think this is the right best step, the first best step to starting to get that story told, get it right, get it preserved. And I do think that Poindexter Village connects us to the broader, migration, the broader stories that are happening all across the state. You'd be surprised how many people are connected, by way of Cleveland, by way of Cincinnati, Dayton. I mean, it's remarkable, and we're all connected. All this African American history is rolled up in Ohio. So just excited to be a part of that, get this museum done so that kids, not in all ages, have a place to research, have a place to start, when they're curious about this information.
And we can definitely thank Miss Rita Smith or young Rita Bynum who helped to get the ball rolling. And I know this is going to be so meaningful for you, Rita. Meaningful.
And I think of my grandparents and Reverend Poindexter, that they were all on the Underground Railroad. They were reaching back, bringing forward. And if they could reach back and bring forward, then just to be able to do that for our next generation. When we started out, we're talking about saving these buildings, the story wasn't for us. The story was for 20 years from now.
For a little nappy-head girl who grew up in Poindexter,
Yeah.
I thank you, and I can't wait.
Thank you.
I can't wait for the next 20, 30 years.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Keepers of the Culture and the story, extended and otherwise, of Poindexter Village, just one of the many Black communities in Central Ohio and throughout Ohio that are part of America 250. As we bring this episode to a close, we are reminded that history is not only something we inherit, it is something we are responsible for. During this national moment of reflection, 250 years into the American story, we recognize that our collective future depends on how well we listen to, protect, and uplift the cultures and communities that have always been part of shaping this country. The stories shared here are not meant to end with this conversation. They are invitations to remember more fully, to engage more intentionally, and to invest in cultural preservation so that future generations will know where they come from and why it matters. Thank you for listening, thank you for learning, and thank you for helping carry these stories forward. I'm Angela Pace, and this is Keepers of the Culture.